I agree.
What questions do we want to see do go over on this? Any others? Okay, we're gonna do 3 and 4, but you guys need your calculator, so go grab that. Antonio, put your phone on your You are 21 big. Number 9 Oh, too bad, Ivy. You were just. I don't care about your spending. We're gonna do number 3 first. That's the one you need your calculator for. Reset it first. Second plus 712. Jacob, put your money. Right. And then go into stat. Go into edit. And start putting in your L1 and L2. And then once you have it, all of your data, go back into stat. Scroll over to calculate. Down to number 4. So stat, calculate number 4. And then we just need a line of estimate. So go all the way down and hit calculate. We're going to put 3 decimals. So y equals negative 0.503 x plus 15.732. And that would be our line of best fit for number 30. Questions there? And then number 4, we are solving for x. So to solve this one for x, we need to move one of the terms with x to the other side. It doesn't matter which one. Let's say I move the negative bx over by adding. So we have a plus 2bx equals negative c. Get rid of the a by subtracting. And then divide both sides by 2b. So that x equals negative a minus c all over 2. Yes. Yes. Divided the So if you did that, you'd just end up with a lot of fractions and have to deal with that. So the a minus c would already be over there. And then if you divided everything by d, you'd have to do this individually. And then would still have to add x over. and still divide by 2, you end up with a lot of fractions. So you could do that, it's just a lot of fractions. Other questions on that? We have 2 more things to learn this year, and that will be done today and Monday. If you're taking the reading as well or anything on Monday, just watch the video or come see me Tuesday after school, Wednesday after school, Thursday. As soon as possible. Wednesday is the quiz on those 2 things. Friday is the test on those 2 things. And those will be the last actual grades before the final. So everyone should have notes that look like this. The last 2 things we're going to learn about are absolute value equations and inequalities. The inequality part will tie into something we've already talked about. The equations will be similar to regular, but also a little bit different. To make sure phones are put away. Go ahead and write in these steps. So to solve an absolute value equation, we need to first make sure the absolute value expression is isolated. It's by itself. We're going to set whatever's inside equal to both a positive and negative version of whatever it already equals. So I'll explain what that means in a moment. Solve both, and then write our final answer in a solution set. We're going to do a few again. Bless. Thank you. Yeah, make sure you're trying this way. So we're going to start with number 1. I have an absolute value. It's already isolated. It's already by itself. I have nothing else to solve, really. So I'm going to take whatever's inside, and I'm going to set it equal to both a negative and positive version of whatever it already equals. Because absolute value measures distance, and you can put negatives and positives in there to get the same thing. And then if these were equations, we would solve them, but we're done. So that would just be our answer in set notation. These 2 grades. Or you can put it as plus or minus. Questions there? If you want to also set it up like this, you can do that. And then solve like that. So whichever is easiest for you. So then we'll do one like number 4. Is isolated. I'm going to take that and set it. I'm going to set it up like this, but you could do either or. Set it equal to a negative 28 and a positive 28. Drop the absolute value signs. Solve for A by dividing everything by negative. What would A equal? And so 1's going to be positive 4. The other one's going to be negative 4. That won't always be the case, but these are more simpler, which is why you have the same number twice. Let's do 7. 5 and 6 will be similar. 7 just adds another step. So again, if you want to set it up like that, or you want to separate it, either or. It's already isolated. I'm going to go ahead and make this equal to negative 34, drop the absolute value, and positive. How would I start to solve this? Subtract 2, kept both sides, all sides. And then how do I get n by itself? I'll divide everything by short. So what would those two answers be? It's 9, 8. So you would write that in your set notation with negative 5 and then. Questions so far? Are there any questions on the front page you want to see you go over before we go to the back? Sure. So we're gonna set it up the same way, set it equal to a negative and positive version of 17. How would we start solving that? Add 5 to everything. We have negative 12 equals negative 2b equals. Our final answers would be negative 11 and 6. So all the ones we've done so far were already isolated. Now we're going to do some that we have to isolate. So go on to the next page when you're ready. So you'll make sure you're writing these down. Okay, so this is when we're gonna have to isolate. I also don't know if it's supposed to. You just have to make it. Everybody our teachers did. You do. Yeah. Okay, it's okay. What to say? You don't have a lot of. Apologize. You're really okay. All right. For number 9, if we were to isolate the things outside, treat it like you're solving an equation. How would we get rid of 2? Yes. Subtract. Then, if there was something on the inside, you would set it equal to a negative and positive and then solve, but in this case, it's just gonna be 10, negative 10. Skip the step, I just went straight to the answer, because it would just be 10 and negative 10. How do I know? There's nothing to solve. And I know that. For number 11, how would we solve that? By 6. So get rid of that 6 by dividing on both sides. And then it's already isolated, set it equal to a positive negative, and the answer would be positive negative. What about 12? Divide by negative 2. Leave it in absolute value, the z plus 3. Then, now that it's isolated, you can drop the absolute value and set it equal to a positive and negative root. So it's just adding another step. And then to solve for z, we would So our final answers would be -10 and +4. We will do some more when we get back. Looking at 13, 14, 15. Which of those do we want to see you go over, have questions about?
16.
16.
Oh,
13. Let's start with those two. If we want to see the other things that. So we have to isolate first on 13. We have to get rid of the 6. How would we do that? Multiply both sides. So these 6s would disappear, cancel. And you'd be left with this absolute value of 2w minus 4 equals 18. Then it's just like before. Drop the absolute value, set this equal to a negative and positive version. And solve for w. How would we do that? You could divide everything by 2, but then you still have to get rid of the 4. And go from there. So either or in this case. But that only works if everything is divisible by whatever. So, and then you want to divide over our final answer sheet. And 7. Any questions there? For 16, we have to get rid of the 3 halves and the negative 24. What would we do first? You could do that. I wouldn't advise doing that first, just because this may be like a 1/3 instead of 2/3, and then you might have your fractions all the way across. So let's get rid of the 24 first. By doing what? Adding. And then you can divide both sides by the 3 halves, or take the 3 halves and flip it and multiply on both sides. Either way works. What would that equal? And now that it's isolated, we can go ahead and set it equal to a negative and a positive. Drop the absolute value. And then solve. Add everything by 4. And then divide everything by 4. You're going to end up with fractions. And fine, just simplify it. What would those 2 fractions be? 4 decimals. Either or. 1/2 is one of them, 4.5. And 3 of them. Or if you wanted to leave them as decimals, 0.5 and 1.5 would also be. Do you have any questions on how we solve absolute value equations? It's that notation. Okay. For 17 and 18, if you isolate the absolute value and you end up with a negative number, it cannot be solved. This would be no solution. So if you go back and you look at all the problems we just did, every time we isolated it, where it was already isolated, it never equaled a negative number. It may have started off that way. Like this, started off being a negative, but then it became a positive. It has to be a positive once it's finally isolated. You may not know that until you start to solve it. So like this looks like a normal problem. If I divide both sides by -3, I end up with a negative, and at that point, you can't solve it. No. So don't assume something is no solution until you've isolated it all the way down to there's nothing outside of the absolute value bar, and if this equals whatever that number is. Because your work may change that. This is the basically what it is. But absolute value cannot equal a negative number once isolated. Because it measures the distance, it can't equal a negative. That's why we drop it and set it equal to a negative. Drop the bars. So then that is all I have for this. Lesson wise, if you want to practice this, there are more problems in your notes. There is a Delta Math on this that is informative, due next Friday. Remember that you have 2 Delta Math that are formative due tomorrow on the factoring. A equals 1 and A does not equal 1. Slash, if you haven't done the other formative Delta Maths, make sure you do that because you're missing them. If you're doing past Delta Maths, email me so I can update your grade. You can work on Delta Math, you can work on practice, your final exam review. Those of you that need to finish the test, you can work on that. Use this time wisely. Hold on 1 second.
Diego, are you ready to finish your test? Okay, go ahead and put your computer away.